church and to that place, and that has spanned generations. One reviewer of the book that you wrote about it called it a sense of place that is numinous. But just can you talk a bit about the sense of place that you feel with regard to St Brigid's, and does it have a numinous or sort of a sacred quality to you?
Yeah, very much. I guess I didn't feel that as a child growing up. It was just the place you're living, and I guess it takes you to move away and come back to realise the sacredness of a place and the specialness of that. I mean, in the first instance, it's a beautiful place. It's a red Romanesque church that sits on a hill overlooking the Great Southern Ocean. It's a pretty dramatic landscape, and so that gives it a certain quality, of course. I think, though, when you stand there, and for me, it's the feeling, it's when you look out at the green fields, those potato fields that our ancestors settled on, that they, only had an acre per farmer. I mean, they started out as very, very humble people, and those same fields are still being farmed by our families, 100 years later. So it's, to me, our story, as I've written, it's written into the soil. You can feel it. You're walking on our history. It's very present for me. So I guess, there's a sacredness to that. There's also the fact that the church is built on a hill, like a lot of churches are built on hills. And for me, when Archie Roach spoke at he sang at the concert to save St Brigid's, he mentioned, said there would have been a reason why our ancestors chose to build a church on a hill. It's where the spirits live, and so our landscape is also very much tied up with our own Irishness, but also the Indigenous peoples and their spirits and their stories. You've mentioned a few times just about the Irish Catholic heritage, your heritage, but also just at that community there. But can you talk a bit about the history of that and what that means to you? The history of our Irish Catholic community. I've learned a lot about it in the process of saving St Brigid's, so I didn't very well know exactly the influence our ancestors had, not just on our local community, but in fact on national history, on Australian history. So they settled there after the famine, before, during and after the famine. As I've said, they were very poor, they were very humble people, but they were also incredibly determined people. They were determined to survive, and they were determined to prosper and to give their children opportunities they never had. They were also very proud Catholics, and St Brigid's, the building, a red Romanesque church, it's a fairly striking building and a fairly ambitious undertaking. So that obviously is fairly testament to their pride in their survival as a community. More recently, just with the passing of the centenary of Gallipoli and Anzac Day, I just recently wrote an article and I talk about this in my book, that our community were actually also very influential on the big political debates of the day, number one being the conscription debate. My ancestors were constituents of Archbishop Mannix from Melbourne, who was an Irishman, an Irish nationalist, and a very loud and proud Irish nationalist who, stood very loudly on the conscription debate. And he was a close friend of our ancestors. He spent a lot of time in our parish. It said that he wrote his famous speech that he delivered in Melbourne walking along the Killarney beach. And so in our community, where across the Western District, across Australia in fact, of course a lot of communities have their avenues of honour and their shrines to the war. In our community there is no shrine, because when the referendum occurred there was only one vote in favour of it, and the entire rest of our community, 395 people, voted against conscription. So staunch were they in their Irishness and in their support of Mannix, and in, I guess, their commitment to stamping their own sense of their own identity and their own sense of democracy. You wrote an acclaimed book about your experience with St Brigid's, but can you tell me about what was it like writing that and publishing a book about such a very personal experience? very cathartic. It was hard. Obviously, writing a book is, damn hard work. But it was just something I merely had to do. And in fact, I wrote the first 50,000 words of it in a very, very short time. I joined a course, write a novel in a month, because I really needed the motivation just to sit down and put pen to paper. I knew the story, obviously, intimately, and it was just a matter, really, of being sort of set a deadline and being forced to write. It was very emotional. The story is very emotional. There's a lot of emotion in 150 years of history. In my own journey with working for the church and then fighting against that church, in my parents' journey, and then in the sheer chaos and exhaustion of that campaign, it was, a total roller coaster. And so writing Saving St. Bridget's was, very cathartic. I poured out a lot of emotion into that, and thankfully, the best bit of having it now published is realising that emotion resonated with people, and people write to me all the time and tell me how much emotion they felt and how much they connected with the story on whole lots of levels. So it feels like it was worth it.
Recently, you've moved into the area of publishing books yourself, but can you tell me about that? And do you see it as sort of like another phase of activism, or like how do you see it fitting into your life's journey, and what are you passionate about with regard to book publishing?
Becoming a publisher at Garrett Publishing, a Catholic publisher, a religious publisher, felt like a bit of a strange move, I guess. I just spent, a decade in this campaign to save St. Bridget's, standing against the Catholic Church, and then being quite critical of it in my own writing and public speaking about it. And then all of a sudden, sort of, being in this conversation about could I work for a Catholic publisher. And I toyed with the idea for quite a while, actually, because firstly, I wasn't a publisher by trade. Obviously, I've got a many and varied background, but having gone through the hard slog of publishing my own book, they say you only really need to publish one book in order to know how to publish a whole lot, which I'm now doing. That's kind of the easy bit. The more challenging bit is, I guess, finding the books that need to be written, finding the authors that can write them. And I guess, as you say, is to kind of continue my life purpose, I suppose, which has always been, for one reason or another, to shake that bar, I suppose, and to, ask the questions that need to be asked, and to, I guess, challenge people to think bigger and broader and outside the square. And I think now that I've made the decision that I'm committed to publishing and that I'm working with some fabulous authors and on some, really exciting books, I feel like it was entirely the right decision. It's entirely fitting with my career as an activist, if you like, because now, what greater forum, what greater medium is there to really challenge people and make them think than through a book. And that's what I get to do every day. So it fits really nicely.
So you mentioned that you work with, great authors with great ideas, but can you tell us about a project or two that you're working on at the moment that you're passionate about?
That's easy, because we're actually launching one of my favourite authors, I'll say, David Tacey's book tonight. David Tacey is an author who I've long read and admired. In fact, I actually, by the by, wrote about his work in my own book when I was deep in the bush, doing my own soul searching. I reflected on his work, contemporary spirituality, Edge of the Sacred. Some of his books have really influenced me in my life journey. David has a very deep spirituality. He's also very connected with Indigenous Australia, and is, as a Jungian psychotherapist, as a professor of literature, he can write, he can think at the deepest levels, and he's also not afraid to ask the hard questions. And the book we're launching tonight, Beyond Literal Belief, is a book he says he's been waiting his whole career to write. He says it's trying to unpack some of the questions he first started thinking about when he was 14. As most of us do, sitting in church, and you start to wonder, could Jesus really been born of a virgin birth? And, you know, the resurrection, did that really happen? All those big questions, all those key stories in the Christian story, he contends are not literally true, but that doesn't mean that they don't have meaning, that they don't convey great truths, and that we should hold on to those truths. And now, more than ever before, we need to look for the deeper meaning in these stories. And by merely throwing them out because they might not be literally true, we're actually doing ourselves and our own spirits a great disservice. So, yeah, that's quite a challenging book. It'll be quite a challenging book for our audience, for a Catholic audience.